welcome to Life Matters. I'm your newly bespeckled Brendan O'Connell. Is it Orwellian to describe the 2012 Health and Human Services mandate regarding oral contraceptives, sterilization, and abortifacients as health care? And are they really preventative services? We have often pointed out on Life Matters TV that pro-aborts want to and or have changed the meaning of words. For instance, should pregnancy be categorized as a disease? Or is it just one more decree of the coercive force of laws that are leading to the denouement of both the healthcare system and our society? And should we as Americans look at all this from a good versus evil perspective? What's the big picture in the long run that needs to be brought to our attention for serious deliberation? Today's guest on Life Matters will address these questions and much, much more. Today's guest was born in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. After graduating from Wheaton College in Illinois, he received his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University in London, England. In 2000, he became a convert to Catholicism. Currently, he's a professor of philosophy and theology at the College of St. Mary Magdalen in Warner, New Hampshire, where he lives with his beautiful wife and 2 sons. Well, welcome, Dr. Mark Discher.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So nice to have you.
Yeah. By the way, one of my sons is in utero.
He is? Oh,
yes.
He's not quite here yet.
No, he's slated to make his debut in about 7 days.
Wow, that's quite something.
Right.
Well, you recently gave a speech, and I heard this speech back in June, why the Health and Human Service mandate is no big deal. Now, from the uproar that I've heard in the pro-life and free speech perspective community, can you explain this rather provocative title?
Sure. Why the HHS mandate is no big deal? Well, the reason I say that, the reason why I titled my speech gave my speech this rather provocative title, is because I really do believe it. I think that the HHS mandate is not the big deal in terms of what's going on from the perspective of, if you step back and take a bigger perspective on what's happening. If we look at the forest, the HHS mandate is a tree, but it's only one tree in a rather large forest. So the question becomes, what is the forest? What is the bigger ideological and cultural context in which the mandate, such a mandate could take place? I argue that the big picture, the forest, is secularization. Secularization is the big deal. The mandate is just one, granted, somewhat significant, but rather small part of it.
So you're saying the secularization of both our American society and is it worldwide too?
Well, I don't know about worldwide. Certainly in the Western culture, and there are certainly forces at work in our country that are trying to push the country in the direction of a kind of a secular to make the country more of a secular state.
Well,
that is.
What do you mean by secularization?
Yeah, good question. What do I mean by it? Here's what I mean by it, and here's how I've defined it. I think secularism might best be understood biblically this way. If we look at the first couple of chapters, the opening chapters of the book of Genesis, I think there are some distinctions there that are laid out, fundamental distinctions. And these distinctions are under attack in our culture today. And this is what I believe is really what the culture wars are all about, so-called culture wars. But I think they're real. The culture wars are about leveling or erasing these distinctions in the early opening chapters of Genesis. It's often believed that the controversy surrounding the book of Genesis, the opening chapters of Genesis, has to do with evolution and these sorts of matters. Well, those are not negligible matters, and those are certainly worthy of discussion and consideration. But I don't think that's the big deal. I think the big deal is these distinctions that are set forth right there in the opening chapters of Genesis.
And what are some of those distinctions?
I picked out 4. I've picked out 4. The distinctions are, first, the distinction between God and everything else. Second, the distinction between human beings, man, and the animals. Thirdly, the distinction between male and female. And then finally, the distinction between good and evil. If we look at Genesis chapter 1 in particular, but 1 through 3, excuse me, 1 through 3, more generally, these are the fundamental distinctions that are laid out, and I argue that these distinctions are what constitute the Judeo-Christian worldview, or the Judeo-Christian conception of reality. And these are what are under attack.
Well, give us an example. It's like, take the first one. Could you take
Yeah.
each of the four and give us an example of what you
Sure,
mean?
I'll try to from memory. It might be easier if you actually go to my speech and look at it. But yeah, here are some examples. So the distinction between God and everything else. The first verse of the Hebrew Bible is, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Well, big deal. What's so significant about that? Everything. The rest of the text, I would argue, is commentary on that verse. That verse is radical because in the face of ancient paganism and ancestor worship and these sorts of things, that verse strictly prohibits the worship of anything in the visible or created realm. So, worship of nature, worship of ancestors, worship of animals, worship of anything like that is off limits. God alone is the proper and fitting object of worship, and all the rest of creation is different from and subject to God. So nothing in the created realm could ever be a proper object of worship. God alone is. But look what's happening in our culture. We have these green movements and these deep ecology movements that are borderline a kind of worship of nature, even at the expense of human well-being and human flourishing. And this, I would argue, is an attack upon a Judeo-Christian, fundamental Judeo-Christian assumption that lies at the foundation of the Judeo-Christian worldview.
And as far as good and evil is concerned, how does that all play in as far as the secular? So the secularists are trying to diminish man and increase, say, ecology or environmentalism. And what about the man versus animals? What's that all about?
Yeah, okay, so then a second major distinction that's given to us right there in chapter 1 of the book of Genesis is this distinction between man with a capital M, human beings, humankind, and all of the animals. In Genesis chapter 1, man is uniquely described as being created in the image of God. In some mysterious way, the human person, everyone, is an icon or an image, a representation of the divine being. And this infuses each individual with incalculable worth. And this is why the Judeo-Christian tradition has placed such an emphasis on human well-being, the importance of the individual, and the regard and respect that must be accorded to every human person, because every human person, regardless of how beautiful or talented or whatever, intelligent, each one images God. Right now in our culture, there's an assault upon this notion that human beings have this irreducible value, this infinite and irreducible, incalculable value. For example, Peter Singer, philosopher at Princeton University, considered one of the leading philosophers in the world, has been described as the leading philosopher in our country. Peter Singer at Princeton in 2002 gave an address to a bunch of animal rights activists, and he said that conservative Christians are an impediment to the animal rights movement precisely because they elevate the human person above the animals. So if animals are to be accorded the kinds of rights that Singer and many in the animal rights movement want to give them, make them equal with human beings, this idea that human beings are superior has to be done away with. So humans have to be brought low. And he understands, he sees, he's not a stupid man. He sees that in order to do this, there needs to be a kind of secularization of the culture. That is to say, the power and influence culturally of the Judeo-Christian tradition must be mitigated or brought down.
Now, what about, you brought up the man versus woman or male versus female, that the secularists are trying to obfuscate that whole relationship. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think this is another leg of secularism and secularization. The attempt to blur the binary or the distinction between male and female. Again, in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, right there. Fundamental distinction. God creates man. He creates man in his image. And lo and behold, how does man come out? Surprisingly, twofold. Male and female created he them. Well, there are forces of secularization, I would argue, that are at work in our civilization that want to erase this distinction and claim that males and females are really not different. They're interchangeable. that gender is merely a social construct, has not got its roots in any kind of biology, and therefore gender really doesn't matter. Indeed, the most profound and significant, I think, expression of this is the push for same-sex marriage. Because if you think about it, if gender matters, look, marriage is about, amongst other things, certainly sex. And if gender doesn't matter in sex, it doesn't matter anywhere else either. So if you can take the institution of marriage, which is fundamentally about sex and reproduction, if you can take that and dismantle it such that sex and reproduction are not key, but rather just personal fulfillment in a relationship and personal pleasure from a sexual relationship, then you've done a lot to dismantle the importance of male and female who go forth and multiply in the book of Genesis, are commanded to go forth and multiply.
Mm-hmm. And now I noticed that there was an appointment in Obama's group of John P. Holdren as the science advisor. Now you mentioned that in your article that his appointment was really what you'd call a war on woman. Why is that so?
Well, yeah, war on woman, I'm not, maybe. But the importance, I think, of the appointment of Holdren, and he did this right away. As soon as President Obama took office, one of the first things he did was appoint John Holdren as his science advisor. Mm-hmm. John Holdren co-authored a book, I think it was called Ecoscience, with the Ehrlichs, Paul and Ann Ehrlich.
Oh, yeah.
And they're radical population controllers.
Right. I know who they are. They're from Stanford, and
mm-hmm.
we've had on here a guest who was a contemporary of Ehrlich, who now is running the Population Research Institute.
There you go.
Yep.
Right. So your audience, if they've seen that episode, they know something about probably where this is going. Well, the Ehrlichs are these radical population control proponents, and Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, co-authored a book with them. And in this book, these authors flat out state that they think that there ought to be a cap on the number of children that couples can have, and that they're explicitly open to the possibility of forced mandatory abortions in order to keep the population level down. If you look at this, I mean, this is going on in the world, of course, in various places. I'm sure that your audience has been acquainted with guests who've talked about the one-child policy in China. Mm-hmm. And indeed, most of the Chinese fetuses who are aborted, preborn children who are extinguished in China, killed in China, are female. They're female. There seems to be no problem with this from the point of view of the Obama administration. Indeed, George W. Bush cut off funding to the UNFPA, I think it's called, which was the institution that was sending money to China, which was used to support their one-child policy. And he cut funding to that because it supported abortion, and particularly the abortion of female fetuses. President Obama renewed that funding to that organization. So he's now sending money to China to support that organization that enforces the one-child policy, and most of the fetuses who are killed are indeed female. That looks to me like a war on women.
Definitely. Now, what you were talking about, for instance, you talked about an exemption for Catholic institutions on this HHS mandate, or the Obama administration says, well, we're giving you an exemption. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Was that really an exemption, or how was it defined?
Yes and no, it's really an exemption. Is it really an exemption? Well, yes, but is it an exemption that's significant, substantial, adequate? No, hardly. The mandate was delivered, I believe it was in January of this year, January of 2012. Mm-hmm. And the mandate stipulated that religious organizations, all organizations, including religious organizations, would be required in their health insurance policies for their employees to cover abortifacients, contraception, and sterilization. Well, obviously, this is an affront to the consciences of many Catholic schools and hospitals. So a great hue and cry was raised. And very encouragingly, a large constellation of Catholic bishops was univocal in standing against this and saying this is unacceptable. And so an exemption was issued. Well, the exemption, however, is so narrow that it doesn't apply to the schools and hospitals. It's a very narrow exemption. In order to meet the requirements of the exemption, you have to be a religious institution or organization one of whose primary aims is to promote the doctrine of the religion. You have to minister only to people of your faith. Well, obviously, many Catholic schools and hospitals are open to all kinds of needy people and people who come to them for services, not just Catholics and not just Christians. And so this exemption is so narrow that it's often quipped that not even Jesus and his disciples would meet the criteria for the exemption. And certainly Mother Teresa with her sisters in Calcutta who ministered to the poor, they would not qualify for the exemption either.
And then you had a note in this article about an accommodation. What was that all about?
The accommodation, I'm not sure what you're referring to. Which accommodation?
Well, it was an accommodation, I think, by the Obama administration, or supposed accommodation.
Oh, I understand. Yeah, sure. I know what you're referring to. The accommodation, there was an accommodation that said, let's see, how did this go now? Let me try to remember. If I can't recall the accommodation, how it went.
Well, that's okay.
It eludes me, sorry.
One of the things the Obama administration said, isn't the Catholic Church just imposing its views on the HHS mandate?
Isn't the Catholic Church imposing its views on the HHS mandate? No, it's the other way around. It's the government imposing its views on the Catholic Church, or at least that's how it certainly seems to me. Look, if the Catholic Church isn't prohibiting anybody from getting contraception. Contraception is available on virtually every corner in America. People can go and get it. It's not a problem. In fact, the government hands out, according to Senator Tom Coburn, about $300 million of free contraception every year to the public. Anyone who wants it, all you have to do is go down to the county health department and pick it up. The Catholic Church is not prohibiting anybody from picking it up. It's not proposing any kind of legislation preventing the government from handing it out. On the contrary, what is happening is the government is mandating that Catholic institutions, hospitals and schools and such, must pay for contraception, abortifacients, and sterilization procedures for employees. And that is where the imposition of values is taking place. It is the church who is having the government's values imposed upon it. It's not the other way around.
So they're basically, in the whole theme or push of secularization, which has gone on for how many decades in this country, would you say?
Oh, gosh.
30,
I think since the 60s it's really taken off. Yeah, right.
So basically the government is, with secularization, is forcing its mandates upon everyone else, and they're having to comply no matter what.
Yes, that's right, or face very, very strict, stringent penalties. I think the penalties for noncompliance are $100 per day per employee. So say a business of 15, 20 employees, $100 per day per employee. It wouldn't take that long before you've got a lot of money racked up, $250,000, $500,000 in a year or less. It's a lot of money. It's a very stiff penalty. And this is because the government is insisting that these institutions, Catholic hospitals and schools, that they must violate their own consciences and adopt the government's values, that is, by providing contraception, abortifacients, and sterilization procedures, which are deeply, deeply offensive to Catholic conscience.
Now, there's a word that's been bandied about now for about 10 years or more called multiculturalism. Can you speak a little bit, is the word multiculturalism, and it conjures up warm, fuzzy feelings, but is that a deliberate attempt at secularization of our society? And what is multiculturalism, and how do you see it? Multiculturalism,
look, the fourth big distinction that I claim in the book of Genesis, in the opening chapters, that is one of the pillars of the foundation of a Judeo-Christian worldview, is the distinction or the binary between good and evil. This is at the heart of Genesis. The fall, the flood, Cain and Abel. This is all about good and evil. The tree of good and evil. So this is what the whole text is about. It's a deeply, deeply moral text. It's considered, it's concerned primarily with morality and moral teaching. Well, look, multiculturalism. What is multiculturalism? Multiculturalism is a pretty sounding name for what amounts to religious and moral and cultural relativism. Multiculturalism is relativism, wrapped in the pretty paper of tolerance and acceptance and non-judgmentalism. And all those words really are warm and fuzzy. Nobody wants to be judgmental. Nobody wants to be intolerant. So let's just all be multicultural. So what is multiculturalism then? Well, multiculturalism seems to me to aim right at the heart of this fundamental distinction between good and evil. Why? Why do I say that? How does it do that? Well, here's how it might do that. Because multiculturalism, because it is relativistic, it's morally relativistic, it more or less says some cultures do practice A, some cultures practice B, some cultures practice C. Who can say which is any better? None is any better than any other one. They're all equal. They're relativized. Multiculturalism. All these cultures are just wonderful, and let's celebrate them all. So the culture of life is no better than a culture of death or a culture of abortion. This just cannot be right. Yet it's a kind of a shibboleth, even a dogma in educational circles today. This idea that we must be multicultural. And multiculturalism itself is an incoherent notion, I would argue. And here's how it's incoherent. What do I mean by incoherent? I mean it's internally contradictory. It's self-contradictory, self-referentially contradictory, self-referentially incoherent. Here's why. Because multiculturalism says that no culture is better than any other culture. All cultures are of equal value. But presumably, it must be the case, according to multiculturalists, that a culture that adopts the tenets of multiculturalism is better than some other culture that doesn't adopt the tenets of multiculturalism. But that would mean then that if one were a multiculturalist, one would have to say that a multicultural culture is at the same time both better than and not any better than some other culture. This is incoherent. It's relativism. It's the blurring of the distinction of good and evil.
So now, what sort of feedback, when you had that provocative title to your article, what kind of feedback did you get from folks around the country?
Well, at first, immediately, people were a little bit offended because they wanted to hear about the HHS mandate, obviously. That's why they came to hear the speech, and they were concerned about it, deeply concerned about it. So to hear right off the bat that it's no big deal was a bit deflationary for them, I suspect. But after they heard where I was going with this, that multiculturalism is really only one, it's just one element in this larger sea of ideological and cultural movements that I call secularism, which is the really big issue, and this is just one manifestation of secularism, then they began to see how this might make sense, and that really what we're fighting here is much bigger than the HHS mandate. This is my worry. My worry is that sometimes we get so focused on one issue or the latest kind of thing to come down the pike that offends, Catholic sensibilities or the sensibilities of pro-life folks or something like this. We jump on that one issue and we focus on that one issue. I would just like us to step back and take a bigger picture and recognize that these issues are all because of a bigger kind of ideological movement that's taking place known as secularism. And I define secularism as the blurring of these distinctions that I believe are laid out in the opening chapters of Genesis.
Well, very interesting. Well, now, how could folks read this article that you wrote? It's very interesting and insightful and is food for thought.
I sent it to Catholic Lane, L-A-N-E, and they published the entire text of the speech. It's a little bit rough. It needs some editing, but it's perfectly intelligible, I believe, if you go to it and look at it.
And where can you Google it? Because I got it by Google. What are the words you can Google it by?
You can find that Catholic Lane article by Googling either my name, Mark Discher, Catholic Lane, or just Google why the HHS mandate is no big deal. Why the HHS mandate is no big deal. And it'll bring you right to the page on Catholic Lane's site, and you can watch the YouTube of the speech that I gave in June to the Massachusetts Citizens for Life Convention, and you can read the full text of the speeches there.
Thank you, Dr. Discher. Well, we hope you found today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. We believe fellow Americans need to know that radical secularism has created the culture war that is already affecting every life in America, which heretofore was built on the Judeo-Christian ethic. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.